Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. I'm Howard Lerner, the Executive Director of the Environmental Law and Policy Center. Welcome to ELPC Thinks with our good friend Marty Oberman, who served on the Surface Transportation Board since 2019 and has just been appointed to serve as the chair by President Biden. ELPC Thinks is where we bring together experts, environmental leaders, and community partners to forge new strategies for progress. And as you'll hear from Marty, the Surface Transportation Board serves as the economic regulator for America's railroads. Its duties include review of freight railroad mergers, sales, construction, abandonment. For example, the Surface Transportation Board had jurisdiction over the Canadian National Railway's purchase of the EJ&E rail a decade ago, over the proposed Great Lakes Basin freight project that ELPC successfully opposed, and it has some environmental responsibilities too. In the realm of passenger rail, the board enforces the federal requirement that the host freight railroad companies provide Amtrak with priority dispatching and handling disputes. Will provide Amtrak with priority dispatching. And when there are disputes between Amtrak and the freight railroads, the Surface Transportation Board makes some important and tough decisions. A quick heads up, we're recording this webinar. We're streaming it live on Facebook to share it with those who are not able to join us today. A little bit of background from Marty and then what we're going to do. Marty was a board member for the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning, CMAP. He's Oberman. A little bit of background on Marty Oberman. For some of you, we had a little bit of technical difficulty. Marty was a board member for CMAP, the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning. He served as chair of METRA, the commuter rail system around the Chicago region. And he was on the Chicago City Council as an alderman of the city's 43rd ward. Marty brings terrific experience working with stakeholders from all sides of the rail industry and from community leaders and environmental groups. So I'm really pleased to welcome Marty to joining us today for ELPC Thinks. And as some of you know, you'll hear a bit from Marty, and then we're going to leave plenty of time for Q&A. If you have a question, just click the Q&A icon on your screen, type in your question. We'll get to as many questions as we can with Marty during the time we have. So enough. I know you're looking to hear from Marty, not just from me. Let us welcome Marty Oberman, our good friend, chair of the Surface Transportation Board. Thanks for joining us, Marty.
Okay, now am I on? All right, thank you, Howard. I have to say, Howard, that right at the outset, it took me back to my early days in the city council when you started to introduce me and they cut off your microphone, a habit of the late Richard J. Daley. But times have changed, we got you back on.
Thank you, Marty.
On a very personal note, I have known Howard Lerner since way before there was an ELPC. In 1981, I had the audacity to want to run for Illinois Attorney General. And Howard was my mentor on all things utilities and coal, and everything I know about it until now I have learned from Howard. So we go back a long time, and I have continued to rely on him for advice and mentorship. So thank you. Delighted to be here. I've got more notes than there's time for, so let me go over a few things I think that might be worth putting this in context, what we do at the Surface Transportation Board. A little general background. The Surface Transportation Board is the successor to the Interstate Commerce Commission, which was created in 1987 as the first administrative agency in the history of the United States. In 1995, the Congress abolished the ICC and replaced it with us, the Surface Transportation Board, greatly reducing the board's powers and jurisdiction, although they're still significant. But the ICC days, the ICC pre-regulated rates of all kinds of transportation, rail, trucking, and so forth. So just as in the old FAA days, when the price of an airline ticket was preset, the price to ship a ton of coal was preset, and the railroads couldn't charge more, couldn't charge less. It was such a powerful agency that it has been said that back in the 1930s and 40s, the chairman of the ICC was the second most powerful person in Washington. That clearly is no longer true. No one in their right mind would make me the second most powerful person in Washington or anywhere else. That doesn't mean I don't think it would be a good idea. But generally speaking, as Howard said, our main assignment is the economic oversight of the rail industry, and we do that within the current statutory mandate. And I was going to spend a little more detail on it, but in the interest of time, I will just summarize for those of you who are interested. At the very beginning of our statute is a statute laying out 15 separate items that are called the National Rail Transportation Policy. They are completely contradictory to each other and cause us perennial headaches. We're supposed to ensure competition. We're supposed to prevent predatory pricing. We're supposed to ensure energy conservation, honest management of railroads, and all at the same time. Item number 2 says minimize the need for federal regulatory control. So we struggle with that. I am a far-seeking lawyer, and I have already used my legal background to interpret that statute in very constructive ways, and I will continue to do so as we go through it. But also, obviously, trying to stay within what the Congress has mandated. The truth is, our responsibility is massive. Most estimates are that 40% of all long-term movement of freight in the United States occurs on rail, at least when measured by weight, and really affects a major portion of the overall economy. So almost everything you do. I mean, I was astounded to know that plastic pellets made in, on the Louisiana coast end up in your plumbing pipes and in the upholstery in your car and every place else. So we have a massive impact on the economy. To understand what we're charged with on the freight side in particular is to go back a little bit in history. In the 1970s, before the ICC was formally abolished, the Congress had already begun the move towards deregulation, and it culminated in 1980 with the passage of a very well-known law called the Staggers Act, and that is what we still basically operate under. Prior to 1980, there were approximately 40 Class 1 railroads in the United States. These are the large railroads. As a result of Staggers, which removed a lot of the hurdles for railroad mergers, there was a merger fervor really over the next 20 years, so that by the early 2000s, there were only 7 Class 1 railroads on the North American continent. There are really only 4 big ones in the United States, and they've sort of divided up the geography. The Union Pacific and the Burlington Northern cover the western half of the United States, west of the Mississippi. The CSX and the Norfolk Southern dominate the eastern half. The Kansas City Southern, which is the smallest, runs north and south up the center of the country and now into Mexico. And then there are the 2 Canadian railroads, the Canadian National and Canadian Pacific, which are mostly in Canada, but they have a great impact throughout the United States, or the central part of the United States, primarily in New England. So we are dealing with a much consolidated rail industry that is really, it's a practical matter in most places, a monopoly. Arguably, in some places, it's a duopoly, but there are many major users of the freight rail line who are captive, who really have only one choice, and that brings in the need for us to oversee the reasonableness of both the rates and the service that is provided. By the way, I won't devote too much time on it. We were left in the consolidation, the change in all the statutes, with a few miscellaneous assignments, almost none of which take up any of our time. For example, we regulate rates of shipments between the United States and non-contiguous United States properties. So if you are shipping something from Seattle to Guam and you don't like your rate, you can complain to us. To my knowledge, there's never been such a case, and there probably never will be, but it's part of our jurisdiction. The board, one little side note, but it's very important to me. When the board was created, it was created with 3 members. But under the equivalent of our Open Meetings Act in Illinois, at the federal level, it's called the Sunshine Act. As in Illinois, you could not have a discussion between a majority of a quorum about a case, which meant that no 2 board members could actually talk to each other ever, because you became a quorum. 6 years ago, the Congress increased the size to 5 for several reasons, but the principal reason was so we could talk to each other. But that only happened in January this year. Finally, the board reached its 5-member maximum, and like most independent agencies in Washington, it's no more than a majority of 1 party. So currently, there are still 3 Republicans, 2 Democrats. The president, we are Senate confirmed, although the president designates the chairman without having to go back through the Senate, which is how I got there. And I wouldn't have had any problem anyway, apparently, because I don't know what a tweet is and I don't know how to do it. So I have been chairman since January 20th at 7 o'clock at night. Let me just skip ahead here for a second. One of the things that is crucial to remember, by the way, when I was talking about the system and the reduction to 7 Class 1 railroads, as a result of a great deal of consolidation and selling off of railroads, there was also a fervor of the creation of more short lines. And short lines can be railroads anywhere from 1 mile. The biggest are several hundred miles. I think there's one that's 1,200 miles. And there are 600 of these railroads all over the country. And they are a crucial part of the system, because more and more the major railroads have focused their business model on just transferring freight very long distances from their yard to another yard, and then to a very high percentage, the short lines then distribute this freight to the ultimate customer and pick up the freight that's going out. So we couldn't function without these 600 short line railroads, and they get regulated in a different way, which is too complex to go into in this meeting. Our main focus of rate regulation and service regulation is on the 7 Class 1s. I'm sure everybody here appreciates the basic concept of how environmentally friendly rail transit is compared to, except for barges, all the other ways that we move things around on highways. My own view is that, and it is one of the guiding forces since I've been on the board, is that every opportunity we have to get freight off of the highways and onto rail, we should make happen. You should know, by the way, that the House T&I subcommittee, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, is having a hearing next week on this topic. I think one of the great things that's happened, and we can talk more about this, is that the advent of the Biden administration has really heightened everybody's focus in Washington towards climate change and the environment. It's clearly now a priority. It's much easier to move ahead in this area. Even the Association of American Railroads, which has actually always touted the advantages of rail, is stepped up. They issued a very good report, I thought, on Monday, summarizing the environmental advantages of freight rail. A couple of interesting points that they made, by the way, is that while 40% of the freight moves on rail, as I said, only 2.1% of transportation greenhouse gases are emitted by that transportation of 40%. That's a pretty significant indication of how much better we can do if we can get more on rail. should be understood that about pre-pandemic, I'm going to give you a few pre-pandemic numbers. Everything changed, but they will be coming back to those levels, I think, sooner rather than later. A total of about $980 billion is spent in the United States on moving freight. Of that 980 billion, only 8% is moved on rail. Now, a lot of freight couldn't move on rail. Obviously, you can't build a rail line down your street to deliver your Amazon package. But a significant portion of that 980 billion could and should be moved to rail. And here's a fascinating number that was in the AAR study. If we only moved 10% of the freight that is now shipped in largest semis from the highways to rail, we would reduce greenhouse gas emissions by more than 17 million tons a year, which is, according to AAR, Howard, you would know better, the equivalent of taking 3.35 million cars off the roads. So that's significant. And moving 10% onto rail is very doable in my view, and probably more. And that is as much power as we have to move in that direction. That's something I'm very much committed to. But it's not as simple to just say, okay, do it. It all has to do with our regulatory structure. I want to just quickly, because I do want to talk about passenger rail for a minute and then get to the questions. We have a specific mandate and authority to take environmental concerns into account on almost everything we do. So whether it's approving a merger, the construction of a new rail line, an abandonment of a rail line, we do a NEPA review, either an EIS or an environmental assessment. We have our own environmental department with some really terrific lawyers and engineers in it. It's not a very big department. So for big projects, we often team up with another agency like the EPA or the Corps of Engineers to conduct the actual environmental work. And of course, often it is the applicant who is required to hire a contractor who we supervise to do the environmental investigation. But we do it, we take it seriously. And one thing that I have begun to focus on, and it hasn't always been the focus at the board, in my view, is that when we do an environmental review, it's not just to see if this new rail line is going to go through some endangered grouse's nesting area. That's important, but also what are the overall, the bigger impacts, indirect impacts of the project that's under review. So recently, I wrote a very detailed dissent over a proposal to build an 85-mile new railroad through the middle of the Uinta Basin in Utah, which is a wilderness area, which is being promoted in order to promote the extraction of oil, shale oil, or both. Somebody will continue to tell me the difference, out of the mountains there. The question was giving it a preliminary approval before we did our environmental review. The majority decided to go ahead with that. I wrote a long dissent, and among the things I pointed out was that we're entering a period with a greatly reduced global demand for oil, both in the short term and almost certainly in the long term. And why are we threatening a wilderness area with a railroad that should take out oil that may never be needed? We haven't finished our environmental review, so these issues will come up again, and it's not clear what the board will do in the long run. But it is that kind of overview of environmental concerns that we have the authority to deal with, and I think should be very much on our plate. So getting to passenger rail, unfortunately, I guess I am a big passenger rail fan. We have limited ability, but important ability. So as Howard said, when Amtrak was created, we are was the ICC, and now us, we're the agency to resolve problems. Amtrak doesn't actually bring their problems to us very often when they are not given preference by freights as they're required to be given. You can't have a lawsuit every time you're put on a siding. The Amtrak's put on a siding. It's just too complicated. And we have to improve that balance. One of the things we do is regulate on-time performance. We're given new authority in this area, and authority which was given to us 6 years ago and has been in litigation for 5 of those 6 years. And we are now about to have a new set of regulations adopted by the Federal Railroad Administration, which had the power to do that, setting forth the metrics and standards that passenger and freight rail have to meet in terms of on-time passenger performance. And resolving those contests, and there will be some, is directly on our plate. One of the things that I have already begun, have initiated at the board, is to gear up the personnel within the board whose focus will be to handle these intercity rail on-time performance matters. I think they're going to be made. They're remarkably complex. There's nothing we do that's simple. And so I think those disputes will take time and expertise. And given the way the statute is set out, you can't bring a case to us unless there has been less than 80% on-time performance. And that's a question of how we're going to measure that over a period of 2 quarters. So the measurements hopefully will be in final place sometime this summer. The earliest we could get a case would then be 2 quarters later, so roughly early next year. But I want our board to be ready to handle these things aggressively and expeditiously. The other area that we have a very key role with Amtrak is that the statute creating Amtrak set out some formula for how much Amtrak was supposed to pay the freight railroads for the use of their right-of-ways. And when they cannot settle those disputes, they bring the place to come is to the board, and we determine what is a reasonable compensation. We have one large pending matter now. The fact that it's pending is public. It's a fight between Canadian National and Amtrak. Obviously, I can't get into the merits of it. It's still pending. And those cases are extraordinarily complicated, how you allocate costs and so forth. The other major area of concern, and I have heard a lot about it, as you might imagine, since my alma mater is Metra, is what do we have to do with commuter rail? Right now, we have almost no jurisdiction over commuter rail. Unlike with Amtrak, where if a freight railroad is denying Amtrak access to their tracks, the statutes make it clear that we have the power to order such access in the terms of it. We do not have that power with regard to commuter rail. We do have a statute which says we can mediate between commuter rail and freights, but if there's no stick at the end of that carrot, there's not much we can do to force the issue. There is a lot of talk in Congress about giving us similar authority. It hasn't happened yet. I'm not supposed to lobby Congress, so I just will say we stand ready, willing, and able to do what they tell us. We don't have special jurisdiction over high-speed rail other than our general jurisdiction over passenger rail. One of the things we do with all rail, passenger and otherwise, is that we determine whether the rail line is part of the interstate system. If it is, we take jurisdiction over it, and it's very meaningful because there is a very strong, probably one of the strongest and anywhere in the statutes, preempting all regulation of rail if it's part of the interstate system, and only the STB can regulate it. So that in the recent years, the major issues involving high-speed rail are these lines going to be under our exclusive jurisdiction? And I think it can relate to a life or death future of a high-speed rail line. The most recent one is that there has been a proposal pending for years for a high-speed line between Dallas, Fort Worth, and Houston, about 240 miles. And there was a huge debate. There's a lot of opposition from the ranchers down there who don't want a rail line over their ranch, and from everybody else who thinks that high-speed rail would be good for everybody. And there was a big question about whether that was part of an interstate rail system. Last year, we determined that it was because it has a connection with the Amtrak lines that come into Houston and Dallas, which is all you really need. And so we have asserted jurisdiction over it, which will then preempt local Texas authorities from trying to basically stop the railroad. There was a similar issue for the California high-speed rail line before I got there. The board took jurisdiction over that too. There's another high-speed rail project pending to go take gamblers from Los Angeles to Las Vegas. That one goes over state lines, so it's obviously an interstate system. Generally speaking, I have always been a fan of passenger rail and high-speed rail, and I am reliably informed by the circuit courts of the United States that ultimately, as a board member, I'm supposed to use my own value judgments interpreting national rail policy and deciding these cases. So I'll leave it at that. That was my friend Judge Tatel told me to do that in a prior case, or told the board. So Howard, with that, why don't I stop and leave it open for as much time as people want to pepper me with questions.
Absolutely, and thank you, Marty. Judge David Tatel, as some of you may know, who recently announced his retirement, is a former Chicagoan. He began his career as the head of the Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Office here in Chicago before going to DC and then serving with great distinction on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the DC Circuit. So it's old Chicago time, get together here. And Marty, you have a lot of old Chicago friends who have a lot of questions for you, right?
By the way, Howard, the case in which I educated myself exactly what I'm supposed to do was the EJ&E case involving rail crossings in Barrington. It was a very erudite decision, I thought. So anyway, go ahead.
Hey, we'll start with one of your old friends and my good friend, Scott Bernstein. Scott has a question for you about energy conservation. To sum it up, the practice has been used of rail car sharing by freight so that they have full carloads. Do you have jurisdiction at STB, Scott asks, to open an investigation of using that sort of rail car sharing in other areas? You know, covering trucking, covering aviation. Is that something you can do cooperatively with FAA and some of the other regulatory agencies?
Let me be sure I understand about when Scott's talking about rail car sharing, he's talking about how railroads compensate each other when they use each other's cars. They use each other's locomotives too, but is that the
right
concept?
No, I think, Marty, what Scott's referring to, and I know a little bit about it, so I can bring you on board. It used to be that railroads had a practice of they'd use what they called less than carloads. So you might have,
I see what you mean.
20 grain hoppers, but they weren't all filled. They then sort of got smart and they said, let's find ways to do what Scott describes as rail car sharing. So you have more rail cars that are full up, therefore you're getting more efficiency. Is this something that STB combined with FAA on aviation can work together, and on trucking as well, to help get more efficiencies with how we use freight railroads, cargo planes, trucks, and so forth?
That's
God's question for you.
Yeah, under present law, we don't have any authority over anything other than rail. I thought what he was referring to, and I think it is that we do have authority in the rail-to-rail sharing of dealing with how they compensate each other and so forth, although most of those are established through private agreements managed by the AAR, and that can get complicated. But we don't have any legal authority. It's a very interesting idea. No one, Scott, has presented this to me as something that is a need prior to this question. So I'm going to take this back to the board and find out if anything's been brought to our attention, but I think it would require congressional action to give us any authority to interact with these other agencies. I will say this, we are a totally legally independent agency, and we had no interaction in the last 2 years with any other part of the government, which, from speaking for myself, was not necessarily a bad thing. My own suspicion is that the White House never heard of the STB before. But what I am anxiously looking forward to is interacting with the new administration on broad policy matters. I've already had discussions with people at DOT, and I think there will be a synergy, particularly on environmental and infrastructure issues. But that's where this conversation should arise. And I think it's a very interesting question. So I will take it back to the office. Thank you.
Hey, Marty, from some other, good friends from Chicago, Steve Schlickman, others, what's your thinking about Union Station? Is there anything that STB can weigh in on the Metra and Amtrak disagreement on that? And, as you're looking at different opportunities, say on climate, how about electrification? Are there things that you can do in terms of moving the freight rails to look to electrification as ways of saving money and reducing pollution? Tom Murphy's question.
Both good questions. I could say almost nothing about Union Station now. I could talk about it historically, and then I'll tell you where it stands. I was very intent on the renovation and upgrading of Union Station, which is vastly overdue, while I was chairman of Metra. It's owned by Amtrak, as I think everybody knows. Metra is its biggest tenant. Over 90% of the people and trains that go in and out of Union Station are Metra trains and passengers. And I shouldn't comment on my frustrations because now I'm in a different role. Shortly after I got to the STB, and the STB does have specific jurisdiction over resolving disputes between commuter railroads and Amtrak, not the freights, but Amtrak on the use of Amtrak property. Metra and Amtrak, I can't remember who sued whom. I think Metra initiated it in front of the board over the terms of Metra's lease with Union Station, which would have a lot to do also with the renovation of Union Station. I promptly recused myself from that case, so I can't talk about it. Partly, I don't really know where it stands since I'm recused, but if I did, I shouldn't talk about it.
Of course.
But the answer about the legal power is yes. The difficulties between Metra and Amtrak are litigable in front of the STB and are being litigated. On the question of electrification, the little I have ever heard about that in the freight network is that I think the freights regard it as enormously expensive to try to electrify long distances that they move freights. There is a lot of activity going on in the freight power world. Canadian Pacific just announced a venture in which they are going to be experimenting, putting out, I think they already have 1 or 2 hydrogen-powered locomotives. I'm anxiously waiting to see how that pans out. And there is a lot of interest in the rail world about battery-powered locomotives. There's I think they're ready to use a battery-powered switch engine locomotive at the Long Beach port. I read someplace. So I think we're a ways from there. The railroads are very conscious of the need to move in this area because of all the talk about long distance electric powered truck platoons, driverless ones. I'm not particularly anxious to see 10 semi-trailers moving down the highway at 80 miles an hour without a human being controlling them under electric power, but I imagine it's theoretically possible. But that would be obviously major competition in terms of fuel costs and so forth to the railroad. So that's where their focus is. Battery, hydrogen, there's, a big debate about liquid natural gas, which of course is very explosive. So that's where the focus seems to be. I don't see anybody talking about investing in catenary kind of systems for long distance freight, but maybe.
Hey, Marty, a couple of questions from people like Paul Karras, Nicholas Little, and others. How do you see this moving in the future? As there's less need for freight to carry coal because we're burning less coal. We'll see if there's less oil transport in the future. Is that going to be more of a role for short lines and feeding intermodal service? Is there simply going to be less freight that's going on the tracks? Are there things that STB can do, as Paul Karras asked, to help shift freight from trucks to rail, if you think rail is more economically and environmentally efficient, as you were commenting earlier. How do you see all that playing out going forward?
Well, that question is the centermost question on my mind going forward. Traditionally, coal has accounted for about 20% of the freight that moved on rails up until coal started to lose favor for all the obvious reasons. It's now only about 10%, which is, in my view, quite a good thing for the environment. Obviously, the railroads aren't happy about it. Although coal was also one of the lowest priced commodities because it moves, in gigantic unit trains across the country. The railroads when you talk to them, they say they're very focused on the need for them to replace the loss of coal. And one would think gradually oil is going to go down too in terms of volume, and as we move to renewable energy, a huge use of the rails, for example, is sand for fracking. That is a very large amount of freight movement. So there are all kinds of things that will be impacted by the move to renewable energy. Getting the freight railroads to really focus on adding car loads, both from their own self-interest to replace the loss of the fossil fuels they move, and for the benefit of all of us by getting it off of the highways, is a challenge. In many places, trucks movements are more facile. They get a lot of shippers think they get more reliable service. The railroads claim they're improving service, so they can compete. Ultimately, it amounts to rates in many places. If trucks offer lower rates, that's where people are going to go. And that is an area that we have a lot to say about. But our ability to actually regulate rates is very much restricted under the Staggers Act. We have flexibility, and we are one of our major ventures, which my predecessor began 3 years ago, and I'm hoping will come to fruition in the next 4 or 5 months, is to completely revamp the process by which a shipper can challenge rates before the board. Even though we are the only place since 1980 where shippers could come to the board, there have been only 51 rate cases in the last 40 years, which is remarkable, but mainly because the process is not accessible. Rate cases can cost $4 or $5 million. They could take 4 or 5 years. By the time you get from here to there, your effort to ship your product is long past. So we are hoping to greatly streamline that. We have a couple of measures which are under active consideration right now. And I hope we'll act on them soon. So that is one way we can try to get freight moved from highways to rail. The bigger question, though, that I think Paul and the others, that are raised by what they say, is the kind of overall future direction of the freight rail industry, the long-term direction. For some years now, the big freight rail companies have been under a tremendous influence of Wall Street. And as a result of that, they have stripped about 25% of their workforce down. If you look over the last 6 or 8 years, they have focused their movements not on picking up carloads here and there, but on the movement of long trains, long distances. It's not clear that they have facilitated, in my view, the short lines picking up the slack, although they say they are. But I think we are, as a country and as the STB, competing with the forces of Wall Street, which are pretty powerful, to incentivize, because all these moves by the railroads are being undertaken to cause their stock prices to go up. And if you look at the last few years, railroad stocks have been a terrific investment, but that's not always been to the benefit of the public, the consumer, the shippers, and the environment. So I am trying to grapple as a non-businessman, non-economist, non-finance expert with these very complex issues and see if the board shouldn't be steered in that direction. As I said when I became chairman of Metro, you might say, well, what the hell are you doing as chairman of this board under these circumstances? I don't know anything about railroads, but I'm a professional question asker. And so I ask a lot and I learn a lot, and it is an area I intend to deal with.
Marty, there are a number of questions by people about what I'll call community impacts. Our friend Nancy Loeb asks about environmental justice concerns. You know, as freight trains move carrying, say, pet coke and other materials through the south side of Chicago, you're looking at particulates and you're looking at emissions and materials that go off into the air. Durs Anderson and Tony Ferrero are asking about blocked crossings in communities. A lot of concern about the preemption doctrine that limits what communities and localities and municipalities can do about the real world impacts of freight on places like Chicago and neighborhoods in Chicago. What's your thinking about this? What can STB do? And what are the things you're thinking about going forward to get that balance between the interests of freight to move products and the interests of communities to do it in ways that are sensitive to people and health?
Very, very broad and important question. Most of the regulatory authority dealing with safety issues of hazardous materials and things of that nature is in the FRA. We really don't control much of that. Our ability to intervene in the environmental area, environmental justice area, and community impacts, which, by the way, are much broader than just, say, air and water quality and so forth. For example, the debate over the safety of rail crossings in that EJ&E CN acquisition, our ability to limit those impacts was under our environmental authority. It all falls in that area. So we do have the authority, but it is almost entirely limited to when a railroad's asking us for something. So if they're asking to build a new line, or acquire a line, or merge with somebody, that is our opportunity to impose environmental conditions. And we have, probably not as often as I would have liked to, but I think going forward, those will get a close look. But we don't have much authority to go into an existing environmental issue, such as, you know, the old smoky locomotives and rail yards on the south side that have been there for years, and tell them to stop. I don't think we have that kind of jurisdiction. And the question of preemption is a tricky one, and one I take very seriously, because our preemption statute is so strong that there is very little that local governments can do aimed specifically at railroads. And we've had a number of preemption cases. We have one actually sitting on my desk right now that involves some very subtle statutory interpretation. The Congress, as in many areas, hasn't left us with great clarity. And there are many situations which are frustrating to me, in which we end up saying, well, the local law is preempted and we don't deal with it, and therefore you don't have any place to go. There are gaps in the system which ought to be filled. So I find it very frustrating. We just issued a major decision declining preemption, and you may be familiar with it. The railroads, the large railroads, asked us to enter a declaratory order preempting the entire Clean Water Act limits on pollutions from moving sources like rail cars, because there was one case out in the state of Washington where a federal judge said that the railroad was emitting too much coal dust into the rivers from coal cars as they were going by. And I can't say much about our internal workings. Let's just say that my urging, among others, the final decision we entered was to decline to issue a declaratory judgment, saying that the whole question was premature. But if you read that decision, we did give some guidance as to how we think the laws are applied. And if a local state, for example, wanted to enact a control on the emissions from a rail car as that car was going through the state, it would almost certainly be preempted. Because the next state might have a different standard. And the argument of Congress has made it clear that it would be such an imposition on the interstate movement of freight that it has to be national. Now, the answer is the EPA could, in that circumstance, enact a nationwide limit on what can be emitted from a rail car as it goes by. And that's the way to solve that problem. As to local issues like, diesel fumes coming out of the local freight yard, that's really also a national standard. There was a case like that in California where the local authorities wanted to greatly limit the level of emissions. And that never came to fruition, but the board, this was before I got on the board, basically said if they tried, it would differ from the FRA's limits and therefore would be preempted. So again, the place for that is to go to the FRA, and they can enact matters in those areas.
Thanks, Marty. Hey, we have some questions from passenger rail groups like Sean Jean Scale over at our good friends, the Rail Passengers Association. They're pleased to hear about your setting up a dedicated passenger rail desk at the Surface Transportation Board. What do you see the role of STB in terms of standardizing or streamlining access agreements and service outcome agreements so that all the new projects that hopefully are going to come about through the Build Back Better program that the Biden administration is doing just don't get bogged down in negotiations for years between the states, the freight railroads, Amtrak's, and so forth? Are there ways of STB helping to streamline and reasonably accelerate that process?
That issue, we tend to be, to a large extent, reactive at the STB. We do take the initiative in some areas. The truth is we have a small staff. We're budgeted at 142. We only have about 120 now. By the way, one of my missions to fill those vacancies. Since I became chairman, working on it. So all of those efforts take a great deal of person power because the issues are so complicated. To be honest, I've not thought about the idea of standardizing it, the access. My gut reaction is that there is no standard place in our national freight network. It was built up randomly since the 1820s or 30s. And there are a lot of places where the way the rail lines are laid out and the switches and the access points don't make a lot of sense anymore. I said after I'd been at Metro for a few months that if I were starting with a prairie, I never would have designed the Chicago terminal like it now looks. So there may be some things that could be standardized, but ultimately the actual access and use of any particular rail line, I would imagine, is going to have to be very much localized. But it's an interesting concept, and it is something I will take back, like as something that it could be. There's so much that's gone on at the board, to be honest. It could be somebody's already looking at this, and I don't even know about it because I've been so immersed in everything else. But it's definitely an idea worth looking at.
Marty, I'm pulling together a couple of questions and comments from people. One of the things you look at here is how do Republicans and Democrats work together to get things done? And you were commenting earlier that the three Republican members and you have been getting along pretty well. I mean, do you see that as being likely going forward, that as there are more appointments, some of the issues that have been talked about by people really have a constituency among the different board members, and it's not, one of those all the Democrats voting one way and the Republicans the other way and vice versa? How do you see that playing out at the STB as your chair?
Well, it's been an interesting question for the last 2 years. In my bailiwick, which is small in Washington, all those issues have been really determined by the personalities of the human beings who are occupying the seats, and that we've been fortunate. We have not been part of the bigger political brouhahas and contretemps in Washington, partly because we're an independent agency, but largely because of who the people are. It's an interesting question because I inquired when I first had the crazy idea that I should be on this board, what life would be like there, because I was not interested in jumping into something where it would always be the Democrats one way and the Republicans another way. The political pressures on the board are not the traditional partisan ones. We hear from senators and congressmen who are pro-railroad and senators and congressmen who are pro-shipper. And we hear from everybody when it comes to, say, an environmental issue. But you couldn't draw a line across by labeling this on a partisan basis. There are Democratic pro-railroad people and Republican pro-shipper people and vice versa. So the traditional partisan divides don't affect us from the exterior. And what I will say about I think it's fair to say among the 2 Democrats and 3 Republicans now on the board that across some broad measurement of conservative versus liberal in the traditional sense, not the Trumpian sense, the Democrats are going to tend to be more liberal and the Republicans are going to be a little more free enterprise oriented, but not extremely so in either direction. I would say almost all of our approaches to these cases are really defined more by pragmatism. The challenge that I relish as chairman, and some of you may remember, I've had a few opportunities to be a chairman over my, what appears to be a long career now that I look back. I was chairman of Metra. I was chairman of the Chicago Shoreline Protection Commission under Harold Washington back in the 80s. And I was chairman of a commission under Jane Byrne, which none of you will remember, to set up a collective bargaining system for city employees. And my role in each case, and I relish this role so far at the board, is to foment consensus. And it takes a lot of patience and a lot of willingness to talk and be respectful of others' opinions. But I think you get farther, what is it, with honey than with vinegar. And so I see my job as to build unity among board members where I can't do it in every case. And even when there's disagreement, to soften the disagreement. And so that's what I hope to do going forward. Not to quote somebody I admired, but somebody who had a practical view of the political process. Now that we're in Illinois, Paul Powell famously admonished young people coming into the legislature, if you can't get a meal, take a sandwich. And it's wise counsel sometimes in the area of what we do. And so I do hope to go forward. There are some issues in which you may need to lose and declare your position to try to make some progress in the long term. But mostly, I'd like to build consensus if I can, and that's what I intend to do.
You know, Marty, one thing I've always observed is some of the most important work that agencies do is before a crisis occurs. You know, take the prototypical freight rail crisis. A rail car carrying oil hits something and explodes. And then everybody says, well, what the heck was STB doing in terms of safety standards that could have prevented, you know, a catastrophic accident, or we hope not too catastrophic. And the ritual game of finger pointing goes on of who should have done what, where, when, and how. I've always thought one of the best things you can do is say, okay, what do you think might be a problem in the future? What can the board do now that lessens the likelihood of having that sort of catastrophic, you know, accident? I mean, how are you and the other board members thinking about, you know, some of the things that we all hope won't happen, you know, like the big rail car explosion that happened, you know, not too far from Galena, Illinois, what happened near Montreal and so forth. You know, what can you do to be proactive? And, you know, you're not going to prevent it altogether, stuff happens, but minimize, alleviate, lessen the possibility of those sorts of actions.
In those particular areas, we have almost no jurisdiction. That is all under the FRA in terms of standards for tank cars, safety standards, what's allowed, what's not allowed, length of trains, which contributes to that problem. our jurisdiction has to come at it from the economic direction almost entirely, except when it comes to new lines. So for example, in theory, if somebody wanted to build a new rail line through the center of a residential area for the purpose of transmitting, we actually have this issue pending involving that Uinta Basin case. There's a fear that those oil trains will go through a populated area in Colorado, and we have already heard from many Coloradoans that they don't want us to approve the line for that reason. So we would be able to take that into consideration in that circumstance. But in terms of existing rail lines, and if a railroad wants to start moving oil cars down their line, we really can't stop them. But where we can focus, and this is what I was alluding to earlier about the long-term impacts of Wall Street, I have asked myself exactly the question you phrased, but from the economic side, Howard, that 10 years from now, when we look back, if the National Freight Railroad has retracted so much for the purpose of profit taking, and we don't have an adequate rail system, I don't want to be the person that when somebody says, well, this started on your watch 10 years ago, what did you do about it? And I am trying to get out in front of that right now. It's almost my first initiative as chairman. It's taken me some time to define what it is how we at the STB ought to be looking at those forces. And I am working on that intensely right now. Are there any railroad finance experts out in the audience who want to call me after this and enlighten me further? I would invite you to do it. It's a very complicated area. And I will say, I'm not afraid of government action where necessary, but I am impressed with the delicacy of government interfering with markets and not screwing it up. So it's not something you just jump into lightly.
Yeah.
But I think the point is extremely well made. Most people in government focus on the short term, even on the administrative side, because we are overwhelmed with business. It just keeps us busy that we have to do. And on the electoral side, there's very few people win elections by something that's going to happen 20 years from now. And there's not an incentive for congressmen and senators unless they're thoughtful people, to look down the road. But we all in the voting population need to keep the pressure on in those areas.
So Marty, what are the things that, as you're looking at STB, if there are three things that you could really get accomplished as the chair under your chairmanship, what are the three things that are, sort of top of the list for Marty Oberman?
There aren't three things, but so let me have a disclaimer.
I know you're ambitious. You want to get more than three things done.
I do.
And heck, I'm not, tying you down. Go with 4, go with 5, but what's at the top of your list? Yeah. Things you want to get done.
Make one thing clear about my ambitions. This is at the end of my ambitions. After I serve my term here, there's a lot more golf involved. So let me make that clear at the outset. I'm not going anywhere else. I want to make an important disclaimer that's really not very probably important to the general public. It's quite important to me and the internal workings of the agency. Partly because of that long tradition that I mentioned at the beginning about the ICC, the chairman of the STB, by the way, who is not only chairman of the board, but is also the CEO of the agency. And that is a very different role than just being chairman. The culture, to some extent the law, but mostly the culture, is that the chair runs the place. The chair sets the agenda. The chair sets the direction. And there have been more or less dictatorial approaches to that by various chairmen over the last 25 years. My philosophy has always been an egalitarian participatory democracy. So I have been asked many times, by the way, Howard, by the rail and shipper world, how am I going to set the priorities now that I'm chairman? And my answer to that is that I'm going to set them by consensus with my board members. Yes, I have ideas, and I think it's my job as leader to give direction and urging and counseling, but I'm not going to mandate things that I don't have a consensus to move forward on. So with that disclaimer, I would say the three broadest areas, which I think there's at least two of them have been very much discussed, are one, finishing up the very important work to establish an accessible rate review mechanism for shippers. And that has been a bane to the shipping industry since the Staggers Act was passed, for the reasons I mentioned. And I really think we have a shot at making a huge improvement this year. Secondly, doing what we can, given the limited amount of existing competition, to improve and stimulate competition among railroads, which will benefit everybody, but certainly shippers. And if it helps bring, to me, better competition will bring about fairer rates and better service. And so that as a broad direction, and there are some pending matters that have been pending for a long time to enhance competition, in my view, that I want to focus on. And third, and really the biggest issue, which I can't define because, as I just said, I'm still learning it, is to try to get a handle on this the very powerful market forces coming from Wall Street affecting how the class ones move forward. I'll just give you one example that I find troubling, and it's in the public realm, and I've mentioned this to railroads. There has been a major effort in the last few years by the publicly owned railroads, not the BN is not directly publicly owned, the publicly owned US railroads, for the most part, to spend billions of dollars on buying back stock. Those are billions of dollars that are not going into the rail beds and other infrastructure. And I'm not saying they aren't spending enough on their infrastructure, but the UP has recently been borrowing money to purchase stock with, and they've made higher levels of stock purchases than their actual earnings have been. And as one Wall Street analyst report that came across my desk said, I'm pretty sure you can't keep that up forever. So those kinds of forces that could have a long-term impact on just the direction, the size of the freight rail networks, whether they're investing in the kind of infrastructure necessary to increase car loads, and so forth. That's really, I think, the biggest area that needs to be examined, looked at, understood, and if changes need to be made to move in that direction. So for the moment, that's probably my highest priority, but my highest priority is to understand it first before I leap. Or as I like to quote President Obama, I like to think before I speak.
Marty, hey, two last questions if
Sure.
we move toward wrapping it up. First, a question I'm going to combine from Peter Scozzi, Ken Westlake, Patrick Carnahan. What can you do in terms of, promoting environmentally friendlier trains versus trucking? How does that play in benefit cost ratios you might consider? And does the board have any role or regulation or responsibility with regard to CREATE? Something I know you'll know a lot about.
Well, I don't know what we can do to force railroads to spend money on environmentally friendly technology. They say they're doing it now. They would say to me, well, don't lower our rates so we don't have enough money to spend on that technology, but they have plenty of money to spend on it, and that's really not an issue. We can certainly recognize in our costing systems and so forth, we would anyway, I don't think it's a need to change it, money spent on R&D to improve the development of environmentally friendly technology. So we certainly don't stand in the way. I'm not sure we have to encourage that. We certainly want to encourage competition vis-a-vis trucks. And I have been somewhat resistant to a strict cost benefit analysis, because the people who propose, and they have proposed to us that we adopt a very detailed cost benefit analysis on everything we do, basically would stop the agency from functioning. It would take years and millions of dollars to do those kinds of studies every time you want to have a regulation. So we are very conscious of cost benefit analysis. And I think you can get there intelligently, but without having to hire a bunch of economists to spend 2 years measuring every last item of benefit and cost. The second question, part of Peter's question, I forgot. What was the second half of it?
I was just going to ask, Peter was asking and Ken Westlake was asking, if you see freight rail as being an environmentally friendlier alternative than trucks for shipping, are there things that can be done by the board to promote that more environmentally friendly?
Create.
And then Ken's question about create, part of the value of create is to make freight rail more efficient and move faster and less pollution. So I pulled those two together for you.
Yeah, well, I wanted to talk about, to answer the question about create. Unfortunately, when they created the STB, they did not give us the checkbook. Congress still has it. So there's not much we can do to make sure create is funded. I have observed, I think it's fascinating how the funding formula to create came about. The railroads themselves spend, I think, somewhere between 25 and 30% of the cost of create projects. And the board has no jurisdiction to change that. I would just say from a board's point of view, but from my own point of view, since much of the benefits really do smooth freight train movements through the Chicago terminal, which are crucial. I can't remember the numbers, but it takes 2 days to get a train from California to Chicago, 2 days to get it from the west side of Chicago to Hammond, or longer. You would think that the freights would be more incentivized to spend more, and they haven't. So that's all I can do is to say, I think it'd be a good idea. We don't have any jurisdiction over that, but I am a big supporter of the CREATE project. Every smoothing out of the transmission will be less pollution, faster movement, better for passenger. Metra is impacted by a lot of the delays that CREATE has already improved. The Englewood flyover so famously really improved that movement. The Metra trains that go through the 75th Street SIP will be greatly improved when that project's finished. So I'm a big supporter of CREATE, and I encourage everybody who has a checkbook to write the checks. I don't have one.
It's a big one.
Yeah.
Hey, Marty, just the last question for you. This is a big deal job. You know that. I know that. I think it's a great job for you to be doing at the stage in your career and the experience you brought to it. And people here really appreciate it who have been on the webinar. As you're looking at what scares you in the job, what do you wake up at night saying, I better make sure we do such and such so that some bad thing doesn't happen. What just worries you most about it?
Well, it doesn't have the disaster potential, say, that what would keep the head of the FRA up at night, for example, the ones you alluded to.
Yep.
I don't think the job keeps me up at night, but
okay,
which is good. But the one thing that I would answer it this way, that I want to be extremely careful about are the unexpected consequences of things that we do. I think that's what's nerve-wracking, because the rail industry is such an arcane, complex world. The economics of it are extremely complicated compared to almost any other kind of business, and we're in charge of it. And I am very fortunate to have very knowledgeable board members and an extremely knowledgeable staff to keep me in the right direction. So I have a lot of resources to call on to make sure that what I'm proposing, does make good sense and isn't going to cause more problems than it solves. But that is, if anything, makes me nervous. It's just that the actual economic expertise is something I don't come to the board with. I will leave you with this insightful anecdote, which I think was intended as a compliment, but maybe with faint praise. Early on in my tenure at the board, I was getting a one-on-one seminar, which is a great advantage, from one of our lead economists who was trying to educate me on really one of the complex rate methodologies that we have, which I defy most people to understand. And he walked me through it 4 or 5 times. And I finally said, look, I have to vote on measures involving this concept. And I think my vote is basically going to be your vote. I have to rely on you. I don't have my own independent knowledge of this. And he looked at me and he said, Marty, you're a very good lawyer. And I decided, okay, I'm going to rely on you for the economics and I'll rely on myself for the law. So that makes me nervous. And that's why I'm seeking a lot of more education in this world, because, and by the way, as you might imagine, one of the intellectually stimulating parts of the job, which I relish, we've had a number of hearings where we have highly sophisticated competing economists for railroads and shippers coming and educating us on these complicated economic concepts coming from, of course, opposite directions, and we have to sort out who we accept. So I spend my time cross-examining those people because I know how to cross-examine, and some of the truth and light comes out from that.
All right. Thank you, Marty, for what you're doing at the STB, what you've done over the last couple of years at the Surface Transportation Board and before then, and what you're going to be doing as the board chair. I think there's been a lot of interest in your presentation. Judging by the questions, people are quite excited about the opportunity and the experience and the perspective you bring with the new administration. I know we are at ELPC, and I know a lot of our colleagues are as well. So thank you for doing this. Congrats. And everybody who attended, if you want to let people know, the webinar is going to be posted on Facebook. It will be posted on the web, so it's available. And if you know folks who missed it, who'd like to join it and sort of hear what Marty's comments were, just direct them to it. And we'll be sending you a follow-up with the web link and all those good things.
And
so
Howard, I would
wishes
just say,
all. Go ahead, Marty.
Just to thank you for inviting me. And once an alderman, always an alderman. I welcome constituent input and complaints. So anybody who wants to talk to me or has an idea, please contact me. I'm open.
No, Marty, that's a great opportunity. Hey, thank you everyone for joining. Welcome all to the sunnier weather, and Marty, we'll see you soon. Be well.
Thank you, Howard. Talk to you soon.
Take care all.
All righty. Bye-bye.